Welcome to Podforest, where forest pros discuss forest woes. Our goal is to communicate with private landowners on a variety of forest health issues to support management and stewardship of your lands. In this podcast, we'll be discussing important topics in forest health with experts in multiple fields. Thanks for tuning in, and enjoy this episode of the Proforest Podforest. All right, welcome back, everybody. Glad to have you here. Today we are joined by Chris Marais, a PhD student here from the University of Florida School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. Chris is working with Dr. Yuri Holzer, who has previously been on our podcast and will be returning in the near future to talk about an international trip he did recently. Chris is a PhD student, like I had mentioned. His research mostly focuses on applying data science in the natural environment. So there's a lot of stuff with machine learning, genomics, and computational modeling. So there's this focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence. These are buzzwords that are kind of infiltrating our common discourse these days, so this was particularly relevant. But a lot of Chris's focus is on insect identification using machine learning. So Chris, thank you for joining us today, and looking forward to this conversation on these hot topics.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, those are hot topics.
So just to get right into it, I suppose, there's all these sorts of misconceptions, I guess, about AI and machine learning and all that kind of stuff. And I've dabbled a little bit in it in an educational context, right? So I'm a little familiar with large language models and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like a lot of people just think of ChatGPT, or they go to like extreme lengths and think about like the Terminator series. I was hoping if you could maybe help us out with some misconceptions and definitions of what you would say artificial intelligence and machine learning are.
I think that's a tricky question because it depends on our definition of intelligence, first of all, which is obviously quite vague and not specific depending on what field you're in. The other thing is that I do think that most people kind of have an intuition of what intelligence is, even though we don't all share a strict linguistic definition of it. So if you think of that and then think how we use computers to mimic it, that's probably what the closest intuitive definition of what AI could be. I would recommend not to really get your information from an old movie about robots when you're thinking about artificial intelligence. I think the concepts in the film are important to think about, but it misses the nuance of the context of modern day artificial intelligence.
Yeah, there's a big research push for using machine learning, training these models. I mean, the applications are seemingly endless, and a lot of resources are being poured into these areas. So with that in mind, what are some of these broad applications or areas of interest that we're seeing when it comes to the use of AI and machine learning in forestry?
I think when I think about application of AI, I usually ask them if something is measurable in their field. If you can measure something, if you have a sensor for anything, that could be a photograph, it could be a microphone, it could be salinity, soil salinity, it could be anything. Temperature, any sensor is our way of viewing the world, could be parsed by digital computers. So anything to do with that is probably something that AI could be applied to. And then if you're dealing with all kinds of any optimization problem, the machine learning approach that has popularized the description of artificial intelligence, I think, is basically just an optimizer. So it's not too unlike genetic algorithms or other algorithms we used to use or we still use. So anything optimizing. So if you have a problem where you think, oh, this could be done better, I just don't know how. To give examples, something like, imagine you could solve a problem if you had an army of people, but you obviously don't have funding for an army of people, and they'll all do very simple jobs, then AI is probably a good application. So for instance, an outbreak of bark beetles, which is what our lab kind of deals with, would be if you have a bunch of people standing in the forest just looking around, seeing if there are beetles flying about. You probably don't have the funding to pay these people to do that. So that's a nice application.
I'm glad you mentioned insect outbreaks, because I know that's a being in Dr. Holster's lab, that's obviously a huge focus. So I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your research specifically and how that works with insect identification.
So my research on insect identification is very much focused on the deep learning side of things. So deep learning is a type of machine learning where we use artificial neural networks and transformers and all of these different architectures that you might have seen in the news. I use those to identify different beetles from their images. And I'm trying to figure out how much data do we need minimally to train a model that is very accurate. I'm also trying to figure out ways in which we could build a model that identifies beetle species that it's never seen before. Say, for instance, you work at customs and you find a big tree log and it has a bunch of beetles on it, and nobody has ever seen this beetle. There might be one sample, one specimen somewhere in a museum in Europe or in China that has this specimen recorded or this species recorded. We want to be able to identify that, oh, this is something that we should look at. It could possibly be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
I do have to add that when we talk about bark beetles, it's important to know that the vast majority of them are not harmful, which is also, there are more than 6,000 different species, and we're trying to identify the ones that are potentially harmful and looking at them and like reacting correctly instead of just killing all of them, which is kind of bad.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people might think that insect identification is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. And sure, there might be some species that are very obvious and stick out pretty easily, but when you get into it, identifying different species gets super complicated very quickly, especially when you're dealing with thousands of bark beetle species. Like, there might be some that are pretty obvious and there's telltale signs, but some of these things can be pretty subtle. And I'm glad you mentioned that a vast majority of bark beetles are harmless and important and all this kind of stuff. We certainly don't want to peddle anti-insect sentiments on this podcast. But it's an interesting tool that could certainly be really useful in trying to figure out and perhaps catch some of these outbreaks early before they even happen. But that naturally would, involve quite a bit of social and political will to have these systems in place. And, of course, training the model to the best of its ability. So I wonder then, and maybe this is more of a question for a trained entomologist, but when we think about how we define what a species versus subspecies is, I wonder what the implications would be when we're defining species and subspecies, how that would react with the model. Could that model be fluid as our interpretations of what a species and a subspecies are changed too? Yeah,
I love this question. I love that classifying something as a species is not well defined. When I was a kid, I always thought, you have elephants and you have horses and you have different dogs, and then you think, but you have different breeds of dogs, and then at what point is it a species? And then went on to study a little bit of genetics, and then you figure out that, so when they have different chromosomes, now they're different species. But some species have the same number of chromosomes, and they're classified as different species. Oh, what now? So then you learn that, when you're about a certain percentage of your DNA is different, then we classify you as a species, a different species. But now that's just the genomic approach. There's a different approach where you just look at how the organism acts in the environment. There's a different approach where you look at just what they look like. They might look like something entirely different. One beetle might be yellow and the other one might be blue, and they do entirely different things. I think this highlights how when we categorize things in the world, it's not because it's a strict rule and because it's the ultimate way of summarizing information. We do this to compress the world in a more understanding way. We mostly do this, I think, to transfer this information over between people. Because when you talk to somebody that's looked at a bunch of bark beetles, like Andrew, for instance, he knows all the different species names, but he almost has a feeling of these groups of organisms is something different, and then it merges into a different group. I assume that he doesn't think in species just from conversations I've had, but now we need to talk about them as different species. And it's easier for him to tell me, so this is a different species from that one, because I have no idea where the boundaries and things are. So setting a boundary is a nice initial way of describing something, but it's by no means it doesn't carry full information. It's very, very partial.
Yeah, I really appreciate that sort of discussion on how we define things, because I think at the end of the day, as humans, we do like to kind of compress the world, like you said, into more understandable terms, so that way we have just what we perceive as a better understanding of what's happening. We like to put things in boxes, and when things don't fit in those boxes, we get a little uncomfortable, and we want to try and make a new box to either capture all of those things, or we have two separate boxes, or in this case of bark beetles, thousands and thousands of bark beetles, thousands and thousands of bark beetle boxes. Say that 5 times fast. So you had mentioned with this model, you had mentioned using it like at customs, for example. So would this in theory work with, say, somebody would take a picture of a beetle and upload it into this model and it would spit it out? Is that how we're envisioning it working, or would this be on like a scanning tool, or how might this actually work?
This is the ultimate goal, is to have a model available. We're kind of preparing for whichever way this world is going technologically. It might be that somebody is at customs. It might be at some point we thought we might use it for EDRR. I think that is still an ambition, but later. EDRR is, what does that stand for? Early detection and rapid response.
There we
Yes.
go. Cool.
So it's a bunch of people that catch a bunch of beetles in forests to monitor forest health. And then another group of people, and usually these are entomologists that are experts. It has to also be said, when we're talking about bark beetles, there are only a handful of people that can truly identify them really well. So not a lot of people can identify them, so they get all of this work. They get all of these batches of beetles that need to be identified into different species or genera, and they need to work through them. So we thought a computer vision model might be really handy there. I also thought that having a model understand the visual variability within an organism can be used later on then to align this variability with the genetic variability. I have a strong interest in genomics, so I thought it would be cool to align visual features with genetic features. Similar to a GWAS potentially, but slightly different, a little bit more guided. The base model can be used for a lot of things.
Because I understand what we currently do for the most part is, somebody might snap a picture and they might post it on Facebook, or they might email it to Yuri or Andrew or FDAX maybe, or whatever it might be, and then wait for a response, which could take a while. Yeah. And that's not to, how do I frame this? This model is certainly not used to replace their expertise or anything like that, because naturally a model like this needs that human expertise to help build it and train it, for one thing. But it could certainly be used for, like you said, rapid response and early detection. I guess I said that backwards, but somebody could snap a picture in the field and upload it potentially, and then the model could spit it out pretty quick, or at least give it its best guess.
Yeah. It's really important to understand that people like Yuri and Andrew, the most important, impactful things that they do with their day-to-day jobs is not identifying these beetles necessarily. They're researchers. They investigate the world around us and are thinking about larger problems. They're busy people. It's a slow process. If you send them a picture of a beetle, it's not high on their priority list, and I don't think it should be. So it would be nice to have like an extra filtering before it goes to the expert.
Yes.
We do want to include experts in our model. That's the whole point of identifying the outliers, is so that we send the true outliers to real experts, and then they can deal with it and figure out the details of what it is.
So in theory, could this also be applied, and I know you're not a pathologist or a mycologist, but in theory, could this be applied in that sort of context as well, where if somebody's noticing like a fungus, it could be a similar idea of taking a picture of it and uploading it? That might be, if there's any pathologist or mycologist listening, they might have just had like a strong knee-jerk reaction if they're still listening. But I wonder if that could also be used, but I understand there's a lot more to it than just sight.
Yeah, you need to think about, so even for the beetles, it's important to think, can you record it? Is there a sensor to capture the essence of what you're dealing with? Even the beetles are very similar visually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really hard problem to just use computer vision alone to solve this problem. There's a lot more to it. If I had to guess, I'd probably say that computer vision alone will probably not be for fungi. I'm not a mycologist, as you said, but if I had to guess, the variation there is much more nuanced than that.
And apologies to any mycologists who are still listening, who haven't haven't closed the tab that has the podcast playing. Clearly, we are not mycologists, and I'm working on getting a couple on the podcast. So hopefully, maybe we can clear this up in the near future. So, Chris, this is all very interesting, and I think the difficulty in speaking about anything with machine learning and AI is, and we kind of talked about this earlier, is just how quickly it's moving, and we're not really certain where it could be heading and the various implications and applications and so forth. But it sounds like this could be something of use for landowners, some online tool for really quick access, or at least a surface level identification. Am I right in that sort of interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there will probably be a lot of tools that are brewing and coming out in the next, people always say 5 years, and then it's going to be a little bit longer or a little bit shorter.
Sure.
But it is an industry that's moving very quickly. Yeah, our team's working on a bunch of tools for exactly that kind of purpose. I'm sure a bunch of other people are working on similar things. I actually know in the entomological field, it's a big thing. Yeah.
I think there is a resistance, or reluctance might be the better word, to use AI just because it's a new technology. It's changing, and the implications and applications are so numerous and wide. I wonder if we would have widespread adoption of this technology. Now, if we can demonstrate the value of it, if this model, which it sounds wonderful and very interesting, and I really hope it succeeds, training these models is incredibly difficult. But if that is a successful tool and we can demonstrate it's trustworthy and fairly accurate, then yeah, we might see that adoption. But if it's not a sufficient replacement for human expertise, then it's, people might be reluctant to use it. So I guess then the question then is, how might we convince more people to embrace, might be too strong of a word, but be more open to the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning?
Yeah, I do think that embrace is too much, because I don't think we should embrace it with open arms. I mean, if you look at, I think there's one field of people that does truly embrace this, and that is the fintech bros, and they're all on top of this, and they just want to make money, and they think, short term I'm going to make millions of dollars. And I think these are always the hype boys, they're not necessarily the people to follow or take inspiration from. And I think the naturalists are reluctant because it feels unnatural. This is my perspective. Why do you think there is reluctance for AI adoption?
I used to be very reluctant on the use of AI, and truth be told, it honestly was because I didn't fully understand it. Okay, I'm not going to pretend to even remotely fully understand it now, but it was just something that made me uncomfortable. I wasn't thinking of Terminator, right? That wasn't my concern of using ChatGPT or anything like that. It was more just, I didn't fully understand it. I didn't trust it. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, anytime I use ChatGPT to automate something or just kind of get like another opinion on something, I keep what it says, quote unquote says, with a heavy grain of salt, right? Because it could still spit out complete BS.
Oh, yeah.
Or things that I don't agree with. So I try to use, a chatbot like that just to kind of augment what I'm already doing, and to sometimes automate mundane things, perhaps. But I don't use it to replace my creativity and sort of work ethic, I guess. Like, I'll write up something. Maybe it's a handout for a conference, right? So, just a few days ago, I was at the Southeastern Society of American Foresters meeting, and we wrote up like a one-pager for this project that we're doing. And I ran it through ChatGPT after we had already written it, because I wanted to see, like, are there any suggestions for clarity or making this jazzier or whatever, right? And it spit out a new document, basically. I didn't really like the new document, so I only took a couple of the suggested changes. But I still kept pretty much 98% of what we had already written. And that's just how I tend to use it. If I'm having a hard day writing something, I might use it to kind of just help me generate some ideas or get over that writer's block. But I think there's this kind of ingrained stereotype of using it to cheat on assessments, assignments. Some might say dumbing down people. Like, when rear view cameras came out in cars, right, you get people that might over depend on them. Don't get me wrong, I love a backup camera.
Mm-hmm.
But when you become overly dependent, you lose something else, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're talking about. The overuse of it, we might start to lose some of that human element, that critical and creative element. Not even mentioning the amount of energy it actually takes to operate, these servers and all that kind of stuff. There is, of course, that environmental aspect to actually using it, sure. And various ethics on who can use it and what it's actually spitting out and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's just all these little kinks in it. It's still an incredible thing, and the implications of machine learning are incredible. Kind of trying to find where we can automate the mundane and augment what we're capable of. I think that's the big question, to me anyway, as somebody who's not an expert on this at all.
I like that conclusion. I very much agree with that, is that we should try and automate the mundane. Also, full reliance on things like that. Say, for instance, again, you mentioned using these language models to do your homework. I do think that highlights the true problem, which is we're not measuring understanding that well in education environments. We don't know how to measure understanding for these models either. This is it's a really hard problem. I think there are a lot of people that it's highlighted this problem. I think there are a lot of people thinking about this now, which they previously didn't. My mom's also a lecturer, and she thought about how she needed to restructure her exams and her tests and assignments and things because you don't want people to not use the model, because that's also redundant, because you can learn a bunch from it. It's a great information aggregator. If you had a bunch of things to read and you need a few summaries very quickly to understand whether it's worthwhile to go into the details, perfect. It's really handy for that. If you have like a full textbook, should I read this textbook? Does it have the information I need in it? No, it doesn't. Okay, move on to the next one. This one does? Cool. Read that one.
Yeah.
I think it's a great thesaurus. I use it for that. I'm also, English is not my home language, so
sure.
I also struggle to remember or come up with words sometimes that are the most appropriate. So sorry if I say things in an inappropriate way, but for writing especially, finding those words that there's a better description of what you're trying to say, but you just can't think of it in the moment.
Yeah.
It speeds up that process.
Yep.
It makes writing a lot easier. So I could say, hey, what's a better word to use for this concept? It's a great use for this tool. Over-reliance on it, is still something else.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to navigate, to me anyway, because I've only fairly recently become far more comfortable with it. And that was just through kind of just going into it and reading up on it and playing around with it, so to speak. But anything I ask it to do, you got to double check it.
Yes.
You have to look into it because it can 100% spit out things that, for one, are just incorrect or are just not clear whatsoever. And also, of course, if we use like the current model for GPT or whatever, it only goes up to what, 2021? And it's not necessarily generating new ideas and new concepts. It's generating what already exists. So it's a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
For sure.
I would like to touch on that. A lot of what my job is I translate a bunch of biologists' ideas into machine code. These models are extremely good at that. The first job that I think will be replaced is the job of the people that are building these things.
Yeah.
Which is very ironic, and kind of there's horrible beauty to it, I think. I think as soon as those jobs start to become threatened, people in their personal lives could restructure their decisions. Should we as a society and as governments probably make decisions and prepare for that beforehand? Yes, absolutely. But if individuals, I think, can wait a little bit. Individuals have a little bit of lag that they can deal with. So it's really important to think and be conscious of the fact that I need to use this model to teach me.
Yes.
That's the end goal thing.
Yeah, because when I've used it to clarify some of my writing, perhaps, I did walk away from it thinking about my writing in the future. And it's like, yeah, I've kind of taken those sort of strategies, and now I kind of look at my own writing, and I'm able to kind of predict it, for lack of a better word. On UF's Navigator, you can create your own chatbot. I'm sure you're familiar with that, and it's really cool because you can import it and export it as a file. And what I would love to do is develop a bot, and it could be whatever it is, right? You give it its role and have students feed it whatever information. Maybe it's an integrated pest management plan. And then this bot is either a policymaker or professional, whatever it is. You play around with it. And then I'd want students to then take what the AI says and evaluate the AI's response. So the benefits to me are twofold. They get experience working with a bot, but then also get to critically analyze and reflect on what it's saying to then vouch for, maybe, is it valid? Is it even remotely realistic? Is it accurate? And then kind of critically dissect what the chatbot is saying in response to their plan, for example. So just things to kind of incorporate that reflection element and that experiential learning.
I like that approach. I do think there's value in it. I've also thought about I, for a time, wanted to teach a class, but there was no time. And I structured the whole thing with Geraldine. We just didn't figure it out. But the plan was to set up our assessments in such a way where you use the feed that they have with a chatbot. Mm-hmm. And you give them a topic, say a start topic and an end topic, and say, you need to move from this topic to this topic, and you need to ask it questions, and then you evaluate them on the questions they ask. Because I think there's more truth that you can learn from someone's understanding looking at the questions they ask about a topic than the answers that they give. So if you can see what types of questions this person asks, you can say, this is a higher tier question. This person is curious. They understand what they've just read, and they're interested in what could be moved next. So that was one way of doing it. The other one was to use them to kind of guide the class themselves, see where the trail of questions lead them, and say, oh, most people are interested in this subfield of this topic that we started off on. Let's focus on that next, and then move from that onwards.
Interesting. So it kind of makes me think of doing proofs in trigonometry. Like you have a designated start point and a designated end point. Find the path.
Oh, that's a cool analogy. I like that. Yeah, very similar to that.
Interesting.
But focusing on the questions, describing information through questions, I think is still very creative.
There's a lot of heavy questions, a lot of heavy topics and rabbit holes and what have you when it comes to AI and machine learning and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of possibilities. That's a good way to put it, I guess. A lot of possibilities and a lot of implications for forest health.
The people interested in forest health might be a minority group. I don't think the majority of people think about forest health as much as they should or as much as we want them to. Mm-hmm. And these tools give people the power to act, to make a difference truly to the natural world, even as a small group of people.
Well, Chris, there's certainly a lot of implications and possibilities when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, especially in forest health. I mean, well beyond forest health, of course. A lot of big questions to think about, a lot of rabbit holes to go into, and a lot of concerns, I think, from a lot of people. But this does change quickly, and we're just going to have to kind of see where it goes. A lot of interesting topics and discussion. So, Chris, thank you for joining us today for this really lively discussion on AI.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was fun.
All right. And on that note, thank you, everybody, for listening. Stay tuned for the next episode. We'll see you there.
Thanks for tuning in. For more information, head on over to the Proforest website at proforesthealth.org. For any questions you may have, or to stay updated on all things Proforest, check out our social media at ProforestUF on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Episode hosted by Dr. Tyler Carney. This podcast was edited by Ben Ginkars Davies. The Proforest Podforest is brought to you by Proforest, Proactive Forest Health and Resilience at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.